Thank you. All right, I'm going to go ahead and call this work session to order on AO 2021-26, changing the use-specific standards for large animal facility and removing outdated code language. Let's start with the roll call, please.
Chair Rivera.
Present.
Vice Chair Weddleton.
Here.
Ms. Allard.
Here.
Mr. Constant.
Here.
Mr. Dunbar.
He is excused.
Thank you. Ms. Kennedy.
Here.
Ms. LaFrance.
Here.
Mr. Perez-Radia. Mr. Peterson.
Present.
Ms. Zolotel. All right, thank you.
Thank you. As usual, if members want to get in the queue, please put yourself in the chat or text me if you can't access the chat. Before we begin the presentation, so today's work session is on an ordinance that is fairly simple, as I understand it. I believe a lot of the issues, which I hope Mr. Weddleton and Ms. LaFrance will be able to speak to, as I understand there are a lot of hillside concerns, are ancillary to the ordinance, but this ordinance, I think, gives us an opportunity to discuss some of them. So with that, I'll turn it over to the administration for the presentation.
Good morning, this is Michelle McNulty. As Chair Rivera, you've mentioned, this is a pretty straightforward code change. We are under current Title 21, there is a requirement to have a certification of compliance with the State of Alaska Anchorage Soil and Water Conservation District Conservation Plan, or obtain a letter from the district showing demonstrated intent to come into compliance with the conservation plan within 1 year. This, the Anchorage Soil and Water Conservation is no longer in function. As well, it's a non-regulatory board. So it's really an impossible use-specific standard to achieve, as they no longer are in effect. So we are changing this that it would just be an animal waste management plan, which is essentially the same certification of compliance that was originally required, but just a different name. And Christy Bischofberger is here to speak more to what that actual application is, and then clarifying that it needs to be approved with the Municipality of Anchorage's watershed management services. And with that, I will welcome any questions.
Excuse me, great, thank you. I'm wondering, before we go on the questions, Mr. Weddleton, can you speak to this, and then happy to entertain any other questions?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And, you know, I think this is an obvious thing that has to be done. And I was around, I don't know, it was through Halo or the community councils on the hillside when we rewrote the large animal ordinance, or it was called the large animal ordinance, and rewrote this section. And everything was very controversial. And this was actually, it was controversial. People didn't want the city doing it, and they were more, some didn't. I mean, it was all over the board. But there was some comfort that Soil and Water Conservation District approval, they were already doing some, and it gave some people comfort. But then now that they're not functioning, that's not going to work. But anyway, so I think in that aspect, this needs to be done. And I contacted the Horse Council and some other people I know who have horses and said, is this an issue? And I haven't heard back. They said, thanks for letting us know. So I don't know that it's not, but typically if something is a hot button issue, they're fast to act. So, you know, I don't imagine this is a big issue, but I don't know if someone's on the line who might want to speak later and could be off on that. But I think to broaden the conversation is bringing this in-house. Do we have the expertise? And we've actually been doing it, and I'm aware of one that we heard from Jerry George, a long email that he sent to everyone that outlines an issue that's been going on for him for a couple of years, where he's got a neighbor with, you know, horses and maybe some cows and chickens and all kinds of stuff going on. And it has been very frustrating for the neighbors who deal with the smell and the runoff and the noise and so on, and extra traffic on their streets. So it's not working for that neighborhood. So I think that's something, I think I saw Jack Frost here, maybe he could talk to the code enforcement side. Is it working from that aspect? And then bringing this, these approvals into the watershed management, are you able to handle it? And, or do we need changes in the rules, or is your sense that the rule's working? Thanks. It's a question and a comment.
Mr. Frost, are you able to respond? And then would anyone else from planning like to respond?
Thank you through the chair, Mr. Weddleton, and yeah, I support we support the ordinance amendment and think it is necessary. I can't, just in discussions with watershed management, I'll let them speak to it, but they are the experts, and having clear guidance with an approved plan with specifics would really be beneficial, I believe, for the community and for any potential application of the plan and enforcement if it's required. So we're in support of the amendment. Thank you.
Through the chair, my only follow-up would be to ask Christy Bischofberger to speak to her team's expertise in handling this application or these requests.
You're on mute if you're trying to speak.
Sorry, I hit the wrong button. Thank you, Michelle, through the chair. Watershed volunteered to take over the duties that the Soil and Water Conservation District had been given in this particular code. We're interested, for one thing, because we have a federal mandate that tells us we must manage animal waste in our runoff. And so we felt like we were probably the best qualified to do that for Anchorage. And so we took over that part. We have a guideline, which we have updated now to be more consistent with what we think are the correct measures to take out there. It's actually more flexible in its language so that it can be applied to different farms, different ranches, according to what their specific characteristics are. So I think we're as qualified as we need to be to chase waste runoff through our ditches to our receiving systems. That's what we do with all other waste streams. So we support this whole animal waste management thing strictly in the waste management, and we cooperate, consult with code enforcement for other aspects of the whole animal barn.
Great, thank you. Did you have any final comments, Mr. Weddleton?
Yeah, I guess that's good. I guess a couple questions come up. Is the existing large animal facilities, do they need periodic review, and would they be under your new? And I think what you referred to there, that you have internal policies, they're not in code so much. I'm assuming that. And do they have periodic review where they'd have to switch to these new policies? And then other issues like traffic and noise and so on. Is that just under a normal traffic and noise codes, and it would be handled by someone else? Is that right?
Through the chair, if you want me to keep adding my perspective, because I don't deal with traffic issues per se, so I would refer that question back to planning and to code enforcement. We do have a guideline. It is not codified, and it could be, but we think it's flexible as it is, and it's functioning as it is. And when we took over the work from Soil and Water Conservation District, to date, we haven't seen anything that we're egregiously unhappy with out there.
Ms.
Okay.
McNulty?
Through the chair, this is Michelle McNulty. Yes, if it's a by right permitted use, or so it doesn't require a conditional use permit, then planning doesn't look at necessarily traffic or noise associated with the use, but that use would be subject to any applicable requirements that are already in place. And then they do, animal facilities have to re-up, I think, every other year their permit. So there is an opportunity to get all of the existing facilities up to date with a more current management plan.
Okay.
Great.
Can I
Thank
have
you.
one last one, Felix?
I'm actually going to ask you to go back in the queue. So I'll put you in the queue. I need to go to a couple other folks.
Sure.
Mr. Constant?
Yeah, thank you. So in the email that was referenced from the member of the community who had some concerns about the current ordinance, one of the things that he suggested that I think I would like to understand better is that when we talk about 10 horses and the amount of waste generated and the required mitigation efforts or the cleanup of the waste, that his argument was there wasn't enough kind of review over time, that many terrible things can happen in the time between when the plan is drafted and the plan is then reviewed. What are the methods of compliance that we have for ensuring that the elements of the planning process as established in this ordinance are actually going to be implemented and managed in such a way that we don't have, hundreds of pounds of waste running into our streams every week or day based on a promise that isn't followed?
Through the chair, this is Michelle McNulty. I think I would just like to clarify the question. I think if I'm understanding the summary of the complaints is that there's a concern that in the time that it takes for someone to file one of these waste management plans and for it to be reviewed and approved, that during that time frame, there's a concern that waste could be mishandled inappropriately.
No, close. But when a plan is approved and they're operating with 10 or 20 horses on one of these operations with 30 pounds of waste per horse a day or whatever it is, between the time when they're approved and then next up for review, what is the nature of compliance in this to ensure that we actually have a process where people are going to follow it, not just say they're going to do it?
Thank you for the clarification. Jack Frost, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but do you have a response?
So just to clarify the question, Mr. Chair, the question is Mr. Constant, through the chair, once the plan is approved, and so then there'll be another 2-year period before it's re-inspected. What's the how do we get assurance that the plan has been appropriately implemented as per the approval? Is that correct, sir?
Yeah, I believe, if I'm not mischaracterizing the question, that's pretty close to the question that the email asks.
Yeah. So there's a compliance inspection once the plan's approved, and there's a compliance inspection that land use enforcement and watershed management would do concurrently. And by amending this code section to place it under watershed management, it will really simplify things and make it consistent for the community and for any enforcement effort. And the standards would be known by everyone. Currently, we have many times, because of existing facilities, we're working off a plan that may be a number of years old that was approved or maybe even not approved because the council has not been active in many years. So we go on a grandfathered or non-conforming plan that may have had less rigid requirements. So you have more adverse, albeit legal, situations that may impact the community in ways that we don't want and they don't want. So, so the simple question is, a compliance inspection is required, but this would allow watershed management to implement the plan and then inspect it.
So one-time inspection after the authorization of the plan, and then probably a year and 3/4 before we look at the plan again.
Sure, unless there's a complaint that they're not following it. Yeah, because once they're in compliance, there's there's not an ongoing making sure that they're keeping up with it. They're just.
So one last question, Chair. Is there, and I didn't notice this in the ordinance, a notification requirement for the plan process, or is this something that's just by right and in the department's hands?
Through the chair, this is Michelle McNulty. If it falls under a permitted accessory use, then it's by right and there is no notification process. If the amount of horses creates a situation where a conditional use permit is required, then there would be a noticing requirement. And it's typical that when for permitted uses and there's permits or other type of use specific standards that are required, that we don't public notice those.
So yeah, and it's interesting because how would the neighbors know that there's a plan, and how would they know to complain, and how, okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Peterson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm wondering if there's been a proliferation in large animal facilities in recent years. Have we been having an increase in these facilities being developed? And exactly how many do we have right now? Do we know? Thank you.
Through the chair, I don't have, this is Michelle McNulty. I have not seen an increase in new administrative approvals coming through, and I've never seen a conditional use permit come through since I've been in my current position. Jack or Christy, I don't know if you have your finger on the pulse of that, whether they're increasing or decreasing, and I'm sorry, Mr. Peterson, I forgot the second part of your question.
Well, so I'm thinking, I was wondering if we're getting more complaints, if we have more facilities, maybe we're getting more complaints. Just was trying to drill down as to what the reason that this change may have, the decision was made to make this change. Was this because they were getting more complaints, or?
Through the chair, no, sorry. The decision to make the change was because the Anchorage Soils and Conservation group went defunct. They're no longer operating. So we had to identify some reviewing agency to review the plan. So that's why this change is coming forward. And I'm sorry, I think the second part of your question, in addition to are we seeing an increase, was if we had an idea of how many. And I don't know the answer off the top of my head, but that's definitely something we can find out for you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chair, if I may speak to Mr. Peterson's question.
Sure, go ahead.
So, Mr. Peterson, through the chair, I've been dealing with this type of situation since 1995, and there's not been a proliferation of additional LDAs. However, we've had this issue for years and have tried to solve it. And because the council was non-regulatory and advisory, which Mr. Weddleton spoke to earlier, which is how they wanted it, and it worked fine while the council was active, and it was primarily headed up by one person who was very diligent, did an excellent job, and then just through time, it's tapered off, and so we've discussed making this code change for at least 5 to 7 years at various times, and what we've been left with by not making it is that, as I referenced before, we have some old non-conforming plans that we enforce to the letter of the plan, but they're just simply not adequate, and it's not regulatory because it was by essentially an advisory council. It's not a regulatory agency. By putting it under watershed management, this solves an ongoing issue. Like I said, we've had 5, 7, 10 years, even more, and they can actually make it regulatory, and it's where it belongs. And I'm just very glad that we finally have gotten here. It'll solve a lot of issues. So there's not a big explosion of new facilities. This code change has just been necessary for a long time, and I'm really anxious to move forward with it.
Great. Thanks, Jack.
Thank you. Mr. Weddleton?
Oh, thanks. Not really a question, I guess. Just I think this is actually real good information. I look forward to this working better. But it is a bit of a lesson too when we do these things, is when we do things with the code, is not put groups we have no control over necessarily in charge of things that we're required to do. Because I think back when this was done, I'm going, well, that makes sense. Let's do that. And now it's pretty clear. Oops, bad idea. So lesson learned. Sorry, Jack.
Thank you. All right, is there any other discussion? Otherwise, I'm fine with ending this work session early. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close off this work session. We will have this ordinance before us on Tuesday for a public hearing and vote. Looking forward to that. I will see everyone again at 12:10 p.m. Thank you.